The moment your wife laughs at you in a room full of people who respect her more than you, something inside you doesn't break, it sharpens. The chandelier light above the ballroom scattered gold across crystal glasses and polished silverware, the kind of place where deals were made with quiet nods and seven-figure handshakes. And I remember thinking how perfectly everything was arranged, how every detail screamed power, success, control, except for me, standing there in a tailored suit that suddenly felt like a costume I didn't deserve to wear. Watching a man named Chad Wilson raise his glass with that practiced confidence of someone who had never been questioned in his life, his smile cutting through the hum of conversation as he looked straight at me and asked loud enough for 3 tables to hear, "So what's it like living off your wife's success?" And the laughter came exactly on cue, smooth, effortless, rehearsed like a corporate presentation, but none of it landed as hard as the sound that followed, the one I wasn't prepared for, Emily's laugh, my wife's laugh, bright and genuine, not forced, not polite, but real, like she actually believed I was the punchline, and that was the first cut, clean and precise. The kind you don't feel until a second later when it starts to burn, and I didn't react, not the way they expected. I didn't defend myself, didn't roll my eyes, didn't even tighten my grip on the glass in my hand. I just stood there, letting the moment stretch, letting their version of me settle into the room like fact, because the truth is, silence is louder than any argument when you know something they don't. And as Chad kept talking, layering joke over joke, asking what I did all day, whether I enjoyed spending her money, whether I ever planned on doing anything meaningful with my life, I noticed something no one else did. The way Richard Hayes, the CEO, shifted his weight slightly, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, the way his fingers tapped once against the stem of his glass before going still again. And that was interesting, because men like Richard didn't get uncomfortable without a reason, and it told me everything I needed to know. In that moment, that the surface of this company, this perfect, polished machine Emily was so proud of, wasn't as stable as it looked, and suddenly the laughter didn't matter anymore. Because I could already see the cracks, small, almost invisible, but real, and once you see cracks, you can't unsee them. Emily's hand rested lightly on my arm like she was holding a prop, her nails perfect, her posture flawless. Her eyes never once checking if I was okay, and that told me something else. Something colder, that she had already chosen her side long before tonight, that this wasn't a mistake or a bad joke taken too far, this was alignment. This was her world and I was just standing in it, tolerated at best, and for a brief second, a very brief second, I considered walking away, just letting it go, letting them keep their narrative, because it would have been easier, quieter, cleaner. But then Chad leaned in just a little closer and said, "Come on, man, you've got to admit it's a pretty good deal, right?" And the table laughed again, and Emily didn't stop them, didn't even try, and that's when it happened, not a snap, not an explosion, just a shift, like something inside me finally settled into place after years of being slightly off, and I set my glass down slowly, deliberately, the sound of it touching the table just loud enough to cut through the noise, and for the first time that night, I spoke, my voice calm, steady, controlled. The way it always is when I've already made up my mind, and I said, "Enjoy the next 24 hours." And for a second, no one reacted, because they didn't understand, not yet, and then the laughter came back, louder this time, like I had just delivered the best joke of the night, but I didn't smile, didn't explain, didn't repeat myself, I just looked at each of them, one by one, letting the silence after my words do the work, because the truth doesn't need volume when it's inevitable, and as I reached for my jacket, I caught Richard's eyes again, and this time, there was no smile at all. Just a flicker of something much more honest, something closer to recognition, and that was when I knew they thought this was a dinner, a joke, a moment they'd forget by morning, but the reality was already in motion, quiet, precise, irreversible, and in 24 hours, every single thing they believed about power in that room was going to collapse. I did not wait for Emily to catch up with me as I walked out of the ballroom. I did not slow down when I heard her heels clicking faster behind me, and I did not turn around when she called my name the first time. Because there is a difference between reacting and deciding, and by the time I reached the quiet hallway outside the main dining area, I had already made my decision hours before that dinner even started, maybe years before if I am being honest with myself, and when she finally grabbed my arm and spun me slightly toward her, her expression was not angry or even embarrassed, it was confused, like she had just realized something did not line up with the version of me she had been carrying in her head. And she said, "What was that supposed to mean?" In that same controlled tone she used at work, the one that kept conversations clean and contained, and I looked at her for a second, really looked at her, at the woman who used to ask me how my day was without checking her phone halfway through my answer, at the woman who used to laugh with me instead of at me, and I realized something simple and uncomfortable: she had not changed overnight. I had just stopped paying attention to when it started, and I said, "Exactly what it sounded like." And she let out a small breath, half irritation, half disbelief, like I was being dramatic over nothing, like the last 10 minutes had not just happened in front of half her company, and she shook her head slightly and said, "Ethan, you cannot say things like that in front of people, it makes you look." And she stopped herself, but she did not need to finish the sentence, because I already knew the word she was about to use, and I nodded once, slow, understanding, not agreeing, just acknowledging that we were finally being honest without pretending, and I said, "It makes me look like what?" And she hesitated for just a second, just long enough to confirm everything, then she looked away, adjusting the strap of her dress like that was more important than the conversation, and said, "Like you do not belong here." And that was the moment everything settled into place, not the laughter, not Chad, not even the room full of people who thought they understood me, but that sentence, quiet and clean, because it was the truth as she saw it, and people rarely say what they believe out loud unless they are certain it will not cost them anything, and for a long time, it had not. I had made sure of that. I had built a version of my life where I could step back, stay quiet, let others take the credit, the attention, the pressure, and it had worked exactly as intended, until it did not, until the distance between who I was and who they thought I was became so wide that it stopped being protection and started becoming permission for disrespect, for assumptions, for moments like tonight, and I could see her trying to recalibrate, trying to figure out whether she needed to apologize or correct me or just walk away and pretend this was a small misunderstanding that would disappear by morning, and I realized she still believed she had time to manage this, to control the outcome, to smooth it over the way she always did, and that was almost impressive, the confidence, the certainty, the assumption that the structure around her was solid, that the company, her position, her reputation, all of it was untouchable. And I almost told her right then, almost explained everything, how the structure actually worked, who signed what, who owned what, how decisions really got made behind closed doors she had never been invited into. But I did not, because explanations are wasted on people who are not ready to hear them, and instead I just said, "You are right." And that threw her off more than anything else, because agreement was not what she expected, and she blinked once, studying my face like she was trying to find the version of me she was used to, the one who would deflect, joke, minimize, and I was not there anymore, and she asked, quieter this time, "Then why would you say something like that?" And I let a small pause stretch between us, not to be dramatic, not to make a point, but because the answer was simple and I wanted her to feel that simplicity before I gave it to her, and I said, "Because it is already happening." And she frowned, confusion tightening her expression, and for the first time that night, there was a hint of something else underneath it, something closer to concern, and I stepped back, not breaking eye contact, just creating space, and I added, "You just have not seen it yet." And then I turned and walked toward the exit without waiting for her to respond, because some things do not need to be argued, they just need time to become undeniable, and as the cool night air hit my face outside the building, I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and looked at the screen for a second before unlocking it, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward the way I always do when a decision has already been made, and with a few quiet taps, I set the next part in motion. Knowing that inside, under those bright lights and polished smiles, nothing had changed yet, but the countdown had already started. The elevator ride down was quiet in a way that did not feel empty, but loaded, like the air before a storm you can sense but cannot see yet, and I stood there watching the numbers descend one floor at a time, my reflection faint in the polished steel doors, looking exactly the way they expected me to look, composed, unbothered, forgettable. And that had always been the point, because the easiest way to move through powerful rooms is to let people underestimate you, to let them fill in the blanks with whatever version of you makes them feel most comfortable, and for 15 years, I had done exactly that, stepping back when others stepped forward, signing documents through layers of separation, building structures that did not carry my name on the surface. And every decision I made back then had a reason. A long game that most people would never have the patience to play, and as the elevator reached the lobby and the doors opened, I walked out into the cool night air of the city, the hum of traffic steady, predictable, nothing like the shift that had already started behind those walls, and I paused for a second on the sidewalk, not because I was unsure, but because moments like this deserved to be felt clearly, without noise, without distraction, and I thought about the first time I sat in a room with investors who told me to simplify the ownership structure, to make it cleaner, more visible, more traditional, and I remembered smiling and nodding while doing the exact opposite, because visibility creates targets. And I had never been interested in being a target, I had been interested in control, real control. The kind that does not disappear when titles change or when someone decides you are no longer useful. And that is why Atlas Dynamics never truly belonged to the people whose names were printed on the executive page. It belonged to the structure, the one built quietly, piece by piece, through trusts and agreements that most of them never fully understood, and Emily, for all her intelligence and ambition, had never asked the right questions. She had accepted the version of the company she could see, the version that rewarded her, elevated her, gave her a stage to stand on, and I had let her. Because at the time it made sense, because distance kept things stable, because I believed that respect would hold even when the truth was hidden, and that was my mistake, not the structure, not the plan, but the assumption that people would respect what they did not understand, and as I reached my car and unlocked it, I glanced once at my phone, the screen lighting up with a single notification. That mattered, confirmation that the first set of instructions had been received and acknowledged, nothing dramatic, no alarms. Just a quiet shift in motion, and I slid into the driver's seat, closed the door, and let the silence settle again before starting the engine, because once things start moving at this level, they do not stop for second thoughts or emotions, they follow the path that has already been laid out. And as I pulled away from the curb, I replayed the dinner in my mind, not the insults, not the laughter, but the small details, the hesitation in Richard's posture, the way the CFO avoided direct conversation, the subtle signs that the internal balance had already started to tilt. Long before tonight, which meant the timing was not just right, it was overdue, and that made what came next less about revenge and more about correction, about restoring alignment between what the company was supposed to be and what it had quietly become, and I knew exactly where to start, not with public statements or dramatic moves, but with pressure points, the kind that force truth to surface whether people are ready for it or not. And as I drove through the city lights, I placed one call. Just one, and when the line connected, I did not introduce myself, I did not need to, and I said, "Initiate the audit at 9 a.m., full scope, no internal filters." And there was a brief pause on the other end, not hesitation, just acknowledgement of the weight behind that instruction, and the voice replied, "Understood." Before the line went quiet again, and that was all it took. No raised voices, no confrontation, just a single directive said at the right time, and as I continued driving, I knew that inside the company's systems, notifications would begin to populate in the morning, emails flagged, access requests triggered, questions raised that could not be ignored, and by the time anyone thought to trace where it started, they would already be too deep into it to stop the process. And I leaned back slightly in my seat, one hand steady on the wheel, watching the road ahead stretch out under the streetlights. And for the first time that night, there was no tension left, no lingering doubt, just clarity, because the truth is, power is not proven in the moment you speak, it is proven in what happens after, and in less than 24 hours, the version of reality they had built their confidence on was going to be replaced by something far less comfortable, something they could not laugh off or explain away. And the only question left was how quickly they would realize that the man they dismissed at dinner had never been outside their world at all. He had been the one holding it together the entire time. Morning does not ask for permission before it exposes what the night tried to hide, and by the time the first light cut through the glass towers downtown, the system had already begun to move in ways most people inside that building had never experienced before, subtle at first, almost invisible if you did not know where to look. A flagged report here, a restricted access notice there, a calendar invite marked urgent but without explanation, and I knew exactly how it would feel from the inside, that quiet unease that starts as a question and slowly turns into something heavier, something harder to ignore, and I was already halfway through my first cup of coffee when my phone lit up with the first ripple from inside Atlas Dynamics, a message from a number that had not contacted me directly in over a decade, short, controlled, and trying not to sound concerned. "We need to talk." And I let it sit for a moment, not out of hesitation, but because timing matters more than urgency when you are dealing with people who are used to being in control, and I remembered the early days, before the structure, before the distance, when Atlas was just a concept, sketched out on a legal pad in a cramped office that smelled like burnt coffee and ambition, when I was the one sitting across from skeptical investors explaining why the company needed to be built differently, why ownership had to be layered, protected, insulated from the kind of internal shifts that destroy organizations from the inside out, and most of them did not understand it, not fully. But they understood me enough to sign, enough to trust that I was building something that would last. Beyond personalities and egos, and that was the difference. I never built Atlas for recognition, I built it for resilience. And resilience does not look impressive on the surface, it looks quiet, almost invisible, until the moment it is tested. And as I set my coffee down and finally responded with a single line, "You have 23 hours. I could almost picture Richard Hayes reading it, the slight tightening in his jaw, the shift from confidence to calculation, because men like him do not panic immediately, they analyze, they try to understand the scope before they react. But the problem he was about to face was simple, there was no scope he could control anymore, not once the audit had been initiated from outside the internal chain, and inside the company, the second wave was already forming, compliance teams pulling records that had not been reviewed in years, financial logs being cross-checked without prior notice, automated systems flagging inconsistencies that had been smoothed over by routine and assumption, and none of it was loud, none of it dramatic. But that is how real change begins, not with noise, but with pressure applied in the right places, and I could imagine Emily walking into her office, heels steady against the floor, expecting a normal day, expecting control, only to find that something felt off, that people were quieter, more focused, less willing to engage in the casual confidence that defined that environment, and eventually, someone would tell her, someone careful, someone measured, that an external audit had been triggered at the highest level. That access protocols were shifting, that certain decisions were being temporarily paused until further review, and she would ask the obvious question, who authorized this? And for the first time, there would not be a simple answer, because the authorization did not come from the names she was used to seeing, it came from the structure she had never questioned, and that is when the realization would begin, slow at first, like a thought she was not ready to fully form, that the version of the company she understood was incomplete. And as I stood by the window watching the city come alive, traffic building, people moving through their routines without any awareness of the shift happening just a few blocks away, I felt no urgency to intervene, no need to accelerate what was already unfolding, because the truth does not need to be forced when the conditions are right, it reveals itself naturally, layer by layer, until it becomes undeniable. And when my phone rang again, this time with Richard's direct line, I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering, not to play games, but to set the tone. And when I finally picked up, I did not greet him, I did not ask how he was, I simply listened, and for a moment, there was silence on the other end, the kind that carries more weight than words, before he said carefully, "Ethan, we have an issue." And I looked out over the city, steady, calm, exactly where I needed to be, and replied, "No, Richard, you have an issue." And that was the difference, the line that separated what they believed from what was actually happening. because from this point forward, nothing inside that company was going to move the way it had before, and they were only just beginning to understand why. There is a moment when control quietly changes hands. Not with an announcement, not with a confrontation, but with a realization that spreads from one person to another like a ripple you cannot stop once it begins, and by mid-morning that ripple had reached every corner of Atlas Dynamics, not through panic, but through pattern, through the way conversations slowed, through the way decisions paused mid-sentence, through the way people who normally spoke with certainty started choosing their words more carefully. And inside Emily's office, that shift finally took shape in a way she could not ignore, because the reports on her desk did not match the system she believed she was running, access logs showing overrides she did not authorize, compliance flags appearing on accounts that had been considered stable for years, and when she asked for clarification, the answers came back incomplete, delayed, filtered through layers that suddenly felt unfamiliar. And that is when she called Richard again, not as a subordinate checking in, but as someone looking for stability, for confirmation that this was still under control, and I could almost hear the difference in her voice even without being there, that edge of urgency she would never show in a boardroom, because uncertainty is the one thing people in her position are trained to hide, and yet it was there now, just beneath the surface, asking questions she had never needed to ask before, and Richard, for all his experience, did not have the answers she expected because the structure they had both relied on was no longer responding to them the way it used to. And that is the thing about systems built for resilience. They do not collapse under pressure, they reroute authority away from the pressure point, and in this case, that point had always been them, the visible leadership, the public faces, the ones who believed they were steering the company when in reality they were operating within boundaries they had never fully mapped. And as I sat in my office, reviewing the incoming data streams that had begun to surface from the audit, I could see exactly where those boundaries had been tested over time. Small decisions justified as necessary, adjustments made for convenience. Lines blurred gradually until they stopped being visible altogether, and none of it was dramatic on its own, none of it would have triggered alarm in isolation, but together, layered over years, it formed a pattern that could no longer be ignored once the right lens was applied, and that was the lens now active across the entire system, pulling threads, connecting points, turning assumptions into questions that demanded answers. And I did not rush to act on any of it, because the process itself was the point, not the outcome, the exposure of truth before the enforcement of consequence, and that is what most people misunderstand about power. They think it is about immediate action, about decisive moves that change everything at once. But real power is patient. It allows the situation to reveal itself fully before stepping in, because once the truth is undeniable, no one can argue against it without exposing themselves further. And as the hours moved forward, the internal communication channels inside Atlas began to reflect that pressure more openly, meetings rescheduled, directives questioned, departments waiting for guidance that was no longer coming from the sources they trusted, and eventually, the question that had been forming all morning reached the surface, not in a single statement, but in a series of conversations that all pointed to the same place: who actually has final authority here? And that question is dangerous when the answer is not what people expect, because it forces a recalibration of everything that follows, every decision, every assumption, every relationship within the structure. And Emily, for the first time, found herself on the outside of that answer, looking in, trying to understand how something so fundamental could have been invisible to her for so long. And I knew exactly when that realization would fully land, not because I could see her, but because I could see the system responding to it, access requests being escalated beyond her level, approvals being rerouted through channels she did not control, and finally, a single notification that confirmed the shift had reached its critical point, a board-level alert triggered by the audit's preliminary findings, requiring immediate review under the original ownership structure, and that structure did not include her name, not in the way she believed. And as I leaned back in my chair, the city stretching out beyond the glass in front of me, I understood that the hardest part was not what came next, the decisions, the consequences, the restructuring. It was this moment right here, when the illusion of control breaks, when people realize that the foundation they stood on was never theirs to command, only to operate within, and once that realization takes hold, everything else becomes inevitable, not dramatic, not chaotic, just precise, like a system correcting itself after years of quiet deviation, and there is nothing anyone inside that building can do now to stop it, because the moment they laughed, the moment they dismissed what they did not understand, they lost the only advantage they had. Time, and now time is no longer on their side. By early afternoon, the building no longer felt like a place of confidence, it felt like a place waiting for an answer no one could provide, and that shift, that subtle but undeniable change in atmosphere, was the result of something most of them had never experienced before: accountability without warning, and inside the executive floor, the conversations had stopped pretending to be routine, doors that were usually left open were now closed. Voices lowered, decisions delayed, and every few minutes another notification would arrive, another piece of the structure revealing itself in ways that did not align with what they believed to be true, and Emily sat at her desk staring at a screen that no longer responded to her authority the way it always had: access requests pending above her clearance, documents locked behind permissions she did not recognize, and for the first time since she joined Atlas, she was not the one directing the flow of information, she was waiting for it, and that alone was enough to shift everything she thought she understood about her position. And when she finally stood up and walked down the hall toward Richard's office, she did not knock the way she usually would, she stepped in. Without waiting, because control had already started to slip and she needed something solid to hold on to, and Richard, standing behind his desk with his jacket off and sleeves rolled up, looked exactly like a man trying to solve a problem he could not fully see. And when she asked, "What is happening?" there was no immediate answer, just a brief silence that carried more weight than any explanation could, because he did not know how to explain it in a way that preserved the authority he had built his career on, and finally he said carefully, "There is an external audit in progress," as if saying it plainly would somehow reduce its impact, but it did not, because external meant beyond them, beyond their control, beyond the structure they operated within. And Emily's next question came faster, sharper. "Who authorized it?" And that was the question that had been echoing through the building all day, the one no one wanted to answer because the answer did not fit the hierarchy they believed in, and Richard did not respond immediately, not because he did not know, but because saying it out loud would make it real in a way he could not undo, and that hesitation told her everything, because hesitation in a man like Richard meant one thing: the answer was not something she was prepared to hear, and as that realization settled in, she felt the first real shift inside herself, not confusion, not frustration, but something colder, something closer to recognition that the structure she had trusted was larger than she had ever been allowed to see, and that someone else, someone she had underestimated, had just stepped into it without asking for permission. And across the city, I was already reviewing the second layer of findings, patterns confirmed, discrepancies aligned, the kind of information that does not just raise questions, it demands resolution, and I moved through it methodically, not rushing, not reacting, just allowing the full picture to form before making the next move, because once you act, you define the outcome, and I wanted the outcome to be precise, not emotional. And when my phone lit up again, this time with Emily's name, I let it ring longer than the others, not out of distance, but because timing mattered even more now than it had before, and when I finally answered, I could hear it immediately, the difference in her voice, the absence of certainty, replaced by something more controlled, more careful, and she said, "Ethan, we need to talk." And I did not interrupt, I did not fill the silence, I let her continue, because people reveal more when they think they still have room to negotiate, and she added, "There is an audit happening, and no one can tell me who authorized it." And I looked out the window for a moment, watching the reflection of the city move across the glass, and then I said calmly, "I can." And the silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was not confusion, it was realization beginning to take shape, slow, reluctant, but undeniable, and she asked, quieter now, "You?" And I did not raise my voice, did not explain, did not justify, I simply said, "You have 18 hours left." And before she could respond, before she could try to pull the conversation back into something she could manage, I ended the call, because this was no longer a discussion, it was a process already in motion, and inside Atlas Dynamics, the system continued to adjust, access shifting, authority rerouting, the structure correcting itself in real time, and for everyone inside that building, the question was no longer what is happening. It was who is actually in control, and that answer was getting closer with every passing hour. Whether they were ready for it or not, by late afternoon, the illusion of stability had completely dissolved, not in a dramatic collapse, but in something far more unsettling, a quiet, systematic unraveling that left no room for denial. And inside Atlas Dynamics, the leadership floor no longer felt like a place of authority, it felt like a place under observation, where every action carried weight and every decision seemed to echo louder than it should, and the board alert that had triggered earlier in the day had escalated into something none of them could contain internally. A mandatory emergency review session scheduled for the evening, not by Richard, not by Emily, but by the original governance structure that existed above them, the one most executives only referenced in documents but never actually engaged with, and that alone shifted the balance completely, because when a system moves beyond its visible leadership, it means the real authority has stepped in, and there is no negotiation at that level, only outcomes. And Emily sat in that boardroom hours before the meeting officially began, staring at the long polished table that had always represented control, strategy, power, and for the first time, it felt unfamiliar, like a stage she had been allowed to stand on without ever seeing who owned the theater, and the files in front of her were no longer curated summaries, they were raw extracts from the audit, timelines, financial adjustments, internal communications, all aligned in a way that removed interpretation and left only fact, and fact does not bend to confidence. It does not adjust to perception, it simply exists, and the more she read, the clearer it became that this was not a sudden event, it was a slow accumulation of decisions that had finally reached a point where they could not remain hidden, and across the table, Richard reviewed the same material with a stillness that was not calm, but controlled calculation, the kind of focus a man uses when he realizes he is no longer dictating the terms of the situation. And when the first other board members began to enter, the atmosphere shifted again, not with noise but with presence, individuals who did not operate within the daily structure of the company, individuals who were not concerned with office politics or perception, only with the integrity of the system itself, and they took their seats without unnecessary conversation, without acknowledgement of the tension in the room, because for them, this was not unexpected, it was procedural, and when the final chair at the head of the table remained empty, that absence carried more weight than any statement could have, because everyone in that room knew that position represented the ultimate authority within the structure. The one person whose involvement meant the outcome was already defined, and outside the building, I took my time, not rushing, not delaying, just allowing the moment to align with the timing that had been set long before any of them realized it, and as I stepped into the lobby, the same space I had walked through countless times unnoticed, the receptionist looked up with a brief recognition she could not place, like seeing a familiar face in a context that did not match her memory, and I nodded once, not stopping, not explaining, because explanations were no longer necessary, and as the elevator doors closed and carried me upward, the same quiet hum filled the space, but this time it felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because the role I had chosen to play for years had reached its end, and when the doors opened onto the executive floor, the energy was unmistakable, conversation stopping mid-sentence, eyes shifting subtly, people sensing something without fully understanding it. And I walked past them without acknowledgement, not out of disregard, but because this was not about them. It was about the structure they operated within, and as I reached the boardroom doors, I paused for a fraction of a second, not out of hesitation, but to mark the transition between what had been and what was about to be, and then I opened the door and stepped inside, and the room went still in a way that silence alone cannot describe, not loud, not abrupt, just absolute. Because recognition does not need explanation when it arrives at the right moment, and Emily's eyes locked onto mine first, the confusion from earlier replaced by something sharper, something closer to understanding, and Richard did not speak, did not stand, did not attempt to reframe the situation, because he already knew, and I moved to the empty chair at the head of the table, the one that had been waiting all day, and I took my seat without a word, because everything that needed to be said had already been set in motion hours ago, and now, finally, they were in the room where the truth could no longer be delayed. No one speaks immediately when the truth finally enters the room, because truth does not demand attention. It commands it, and as I settled into the chair at the head of the table, I could feel the shift ripple outward without a single word being exchanged, the kind of shift that reorders every assumption people walked in with just minutes ago, and for a moment, all that existed was silence, not empty, not uncertain, but full, heavy with recognition, with realization, with the understanding that whatever this meeting was supposed to be, it was no longer under their control. And I let that silence sit, because silence is where people confront what they already know but have not yet accepted, and when I finally spoke, my voice was calm, steady, unchanged from the night before, because nothing about this required emotion. We will proceed with the audit findings. And I gestured slightly toward the documents in front of them, not as a suggestion, but as direction, and one of the external board members, a man who had not said a single word since entering, nodded once and began outlining the report, not for my benefit, but for theirs, because they needed to hear it in a way that removed any remaining doubt, line by line, detail by detail, discrepancies that had been overlooked, decisions that had bypassed established protocols, patterns that formed a clear picture when viewed together, and as he spoke, the room did not react the way people imagine in moments like this. There was no outburst, no denial, no raised voices, just stillness, because when evidence is complete, reaction becomes irrelevant, and I watched Emily as she followed along, her posture still controlled, her expression composed, but the difference was in her eyes, the way they moved across the pages, not searching for errors, but recognizing alignment, recognizing that what she was reading matched what she had started to feel earlier in the day, that something had been off for longer than she wanted to admit, and across from her, Richard remained silent, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that anything he said now would not change the outcome, and that is the moment most people misunderstand. They think power is about speaking at the right time. But real power is knowing when speaking no longer matters, and when the report concluded, the room remained quiet for another beat, and then one of the board members turned slightly toward me and said, "Recommendations are ready for execution." And I nodded once, because everything that needed to be reviewed had already been reviewed long before they walked into this room, and I said, "Proceed." And that single word carried more weight than any explanation could, because it was not a decision made in the moment, it was the activation of a process that had been waiting for confirmation, and immediately, the next phase began, not with confrontation, but with documentation, formal notices prepared, authority restructured, roles redefined based on the findings, and as those actions were outlined, the reality of the situation settled fully into the room, not as a shock, but as a conclusion, something inevitable once the process had started, and Emily finally looked at me. Not with confusion, not with disbelief, but with understanding, the kind that comes too late to change anything, and she said quietly, "You knew." Not as a question, but as a statement, and I met her gaze without hesitation, because there was no reason to deny it, no reason to soften it, and I said, "I saw enough." And that was all, because the difference between knowing everything and knowing enough is what defines action, and I had known enough for a long time, enough to build the structure, enough to step back, enough to wait, and most importantly, enough to recognize when the line had been crossed, and the rest of the room moved forward without pause, because at this level, the system does not dwell on how things got here, it focuses on correcting what is in front of it, and as the final directives were confirmed, the tension that had built throughout the day did not explode, it dissolved, replaced by something quieter, more final, because resolution does not feel dramatic when it is handled correctly, it feels precise, and as I stood from the chair, signaling the end of the session, no one tried to stop me, no one questioned what had happened, because there was nothing left to question. Only consequences already in motion, and as I walked toward the door, I could feel their attention follow, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of recognition, the kind that comes when people finally understand the role someone has been playing all along. And as I reached the door and paused briefly, I did not look back immediately, not because I needed to make a statement, but because some moments carry their own weight without words, and when I finally turned slightly, just enough to meet the room one last time, I said, "This was never about the dinner." And then I stepped out, leaving behind a space that no longer resembled the one they had walked into, because everything they believed about control, authority, and consequence had just been rewritten in a single day. The building felt different on the way out, not because anything had physically changed, but because perception had finally caught up to reality. And as I stepped into a hallway, the quiet was no longer uncertainty, it was understanding. The kind that settles in after everything has been laid out clearly, when there is nothing left to question, nothing left to argue, and people begin to adjust, not emotionally, but structurally, shifting their roles, their expectations, their sense of where they stand within something larger than themselves. And I walked past offices where conversations had already resumed, quieter now, more deliberate, because the system had corrected itself and everyone inside it was adapting in real time. And that is what most people never see. They focus on the moment of exposure, the moment everything becomes visible. But the real change happens after, in the way people recalibrate, in the way they carry themselves once they understand the true shape of the structure they are part of. And as I reached the elevator, I did not look back, not because I was avoiding anything, but because there was nothing left behind that required my attention. The process was complete, the correction was in motion, and everything that followed would unfold exactly as it needed to without me standing there to watch it. And when the doors closed and the elevator began its descent, I allowed myself a moment of stillness. Not reflection, not regret, just clarity, because clarity is what remains when emotion has no place in the outcome. And I thought about the dinner again, not the laughter, not the words, but the moment before all of it, the quiet assumption that things would continue the way they always had, that roles were fixed, that perception defined reality. And that assumption is what makes people careless. It makes them comfortable enough to stop paying attention, to stop questioning what they cannot see. And that is where the shift begins, not in the action itself, but in the absence of awareness before it. And when the elevator reached the lobby and opened, the evening light had already started to fade, casting long reflections across the glass and marble, the kind of light that softens everything without hiding it. And I stepped outside into the city air, the noise of traffic steady, unchanged, because the world does not pause for individual moments, no matter how significant they feel from the inside. And I stood there for a second, not to take it in, but to mark the transition, because some endings are not loud, they are quiet, clean, defined by the absence of what used to be rather than the presence of something new. And behind me, inside that building, decisions were already being implemented, roles reassigned, responsibilities restructured, not as punishment, not as reaction, but as alignment. And that distinction matters. Because alignment is not emotional, it is necessary. It ensures that the system functions the way it was designed to, without interference, without deviation. And as I walked toward my car, my phone buzzed once in my pocket, a single message, brief, direct, confirming that the final stage had been executed as planned. And I did not need to read the details to understand what it meant, because everything had already been set in motion long before that confirmation arrived. And as I opened the door and sat down, I placed the phone on the console without unlocking it, because there was nothing left to monitor, nothing left to adjust. The outcome was no longer a possibility, it was a fact. And I started the engine, the low hum grounding in a way that had nothing to do with the day, and everything to do with moving forward without carrying what no longer belonged to me. And as I pulled away from the curb, the building faded into the background, just another structure in a city full of them, indistinguishable from the outside. Because what defines a place is never visible from the street, it is defined by what happens inside, by the decisions made, the structures built, the truths ignored or acknowledged. And I drove through the city without urgency, without looking back, because the past does not require revisiting once it has been resolved, and the future does not need to be rushed when the foundation is solid. And somewhere along the drive, a thought settled in, not as a conclusion, but as something simpler. something clearer than anything that had happened over the last 24 hours. That respect is not something you ask for, it is not something you demand, it is something people either understand or they learn too late. And for some, understanding comes quietly through observation, through awareness, through paying attention to what is not immediately visible, and for others, it comes all at once, in a single moment where everything they believed shifts into something they cannot ignore. And as the city lights stretched out ahead of me, steady and constant, I realized that the difference between those two outcomes is not luck, it is awareness. And awareness is a choice most people do not make until they have no other option, and by then, the outcome is already decided.